Welcome to another video in this 10-minute series. It's me again, Madeleine Bazergi. In a previous introductory presentation, I gave an example of aims, goals, objectives, and outcomes for a fitness program. In this presentation, I will focus on an authentic example, closer to what we know best, teaching. I'm pleased to present what's the difference between learning objectives and learning outcomes. Let's begin by examining the word objective. At the ministerial level, there are program objectives. Those are the competencies to be developed with the learning activities. There are also objectives and standards. The competencies and the elements are both objectives to be met. In a learning context, there are lesson objectives, unit objectives, course, instructional, learning, workshop, and exercise objectives. And I don't mean working out. I know this may sound trivial, but sometimes we confuse objectives with outcomes. Let me make the point. An objective is just a target to be met. What one is aiming for, but in a specific way. For example, a learning objective for this lesson will be, in this lesson, we will examine the difference between an objective and an outcome. It expresses the intent of this lesson. Learning objectives and learning outcomes are not the same. They may be formulated in the same manner, but they refer to different things. Whereas learning objectives relate to the objects of learning, what we will be learning, learning outcomes refer to the results of learning, what will we be able to do with what we've learned. A learning outcome is the result of learning. In French, it's called finalité, what happens at the end of a learning period. Today, you'll learn the difference between objectives and outcomes. That's my objective for the lesson. But you will be able to write learning outcomes for your course at the end of this and the next lesson. Stated another way, learning objectives relate to the intentions of the teacher. They're formulated to express the targets of instruction, the knowledge and skills to be developed. Learning outcomes, on the other hand, relate to the achievements of the learner and are formulated to express what students will be able to do with what they've learned. Learning outcomes are tied to summative assessments. Learning objectives are not necessarily assessed, but if they are, they may be the objects of formative assessments. Just a word of caution. If you'll be searching the web for inspiration on writing learning outcomes or learning objectives, you'll find that some literature confounds learning objectives with learning outcomes. But there is a distinction to be made, as we've seen, especially for competency-based programs where expected learning outcomes reflect the integration or application of learning and not just the sum of all the objects of learning. Here's an example of some learning objectives. The objectives of this lesson are to learn the difference between objectives and standards, learn how to write learning outcomes, and understand how to use a backward design approach, whereas a learning outcome is formulated like this. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to design an aligned course using a backward design approach for a course developing one competency. This slide shows the relationship between objectives and outcomes. Learning objectives are presented to the student at the start of a lesson or a course and are formulated to express what they will learn. Teaching and learning follows to develop the student so that at the end they're able to apply their learning by exercising one or more competencies, integrating learning to solve a problem or perform a task. And an evaluation is conducted to gather evidence that students have achieved the learning outcomes. The main difference between a competency and learning outcomes is that the outcomes are observable and measurable. They reflect specific expectations of performance on a task. Learning objectives are typically formulated to align with the lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy. Learning objectives allows the teachers to help students build the foundational knowledge and skills they need to exercise competencies, to act at the higher levels of creating, evaluating, and analyzing. Once a foundation is built by means of learning activities, the student is in a position to put it all together to solve a complex problem or perform a complex task, leveraging the knowledge and skill acquired along the way. Hopefully, the student would have had an opportunity to integrate knowledge and skills throughout the course of study. Learning objectives are to the lower level of Bloom's taxonomy, as learning outcomes are to the higher level of Bloom's taxonomy. As a matter of fact, if you examine your competencies, you will notice that the elements or the building blocks are at the lower level of the taxonomy than the competency statement itself. That usually requires a higher level of cognitive functioning. When learning outcomes are not specified, the tendency is to evaluate the learning objectives. This type of evaluation does not require the student to demonstrate the integration of learning. Rather, it evaluates their ability to parrot content, and it's reminiscent of legacy programs. Is there a place for this type of evaluation in competency-based programs? Assessment of student progress with the use of formative assessment can certainly ascertain whether students are meeting the learning objectives and are staying on track. Let me give you an example of a course where the learning objectives, learning outcomes, and the evaluation are all aligned. It's for one course in a series of courses that develops the competency. Design a course for a program defined by competencies. Using a backward design approach, I start with the end in mind and ask myself, what do I want my students to be able to do by the end of the learning period? In this case, by the end of this course, students should be able to design an aligned course using a backward design approach for a course developing one competency, design an aligned course using a backward design approach for a course developing more than one competency, verify the alignment of learning outcomes with the learning and assessment activities and with the competencies to be developed, and describe the links to the program's exit profile. Knowing what I want the students to be able to do, I can then figure out how to get them there. But first, I can ask myself, well, what evidence can I gather to determine whether the students have met those learning outcomes? And the assessment will consist of a final project where the student will be asked to produce a course design document. It used to be called a course framework in the past, and a course outline for 2 courses. I even note the evaluation criteria so that it can keep me on track when I design the learning activities in the classroom. So knowing where the student will be going, I can now determine how I'm going to get there. I'm writing learning objectives to guide my lesson from lesson to lesson. So during this course, the student will have an opportunity to explain how competencies are formulated, use Bloom's taxonomy to interpret the level of exercise of a competency, distinguish competency from content, etc. There are a lot more learning objectives that did not fit on this screen. You can tell there's a difference between what will be learned in the classroom and how that learning will be applied at the end. And now I can plan my learning activities. I like to break it down into what the teacher will do, what myself will do, and what the student will do. I indicate T for teacher and V and S for the student. Because it is a flipped classroom, I've decided that students will learn on their own, will come back to class, refresh what they've learned, and then proceed to some activities in the classroom. So they watch videos on their own. There'll be some formative quizzes, there'll be exercises, and probably some other types of assessments during the 15 weeks. It didn't all fit on the screen, but I assure you there's quite a bit of content. So there you go. Start with the end in mind, what the student should be able to do, how you will assess them, and then start working forwards to determine what the objectives of your lessons will be and the activities that you will do in the classroom. Thank you very much, and stay tuned for the next presentation.